Well, today on the show, I'm going to share why most people are not too busy. They're simply too distracted. Why I'm going to address the question of why was it wrong for Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? After all, in Genesis 3, 2, they're told not to. But you might think, well, what's wrong with wanting to know the difference between good and evil? So we're going to dissect a little bit what's going on in that story. I'm going to share some insights from an article I read this week about why parking lots are not built underground. It was a really fascinating history of like parking lots, and so how we got to the cities that we have today. And then I'm going to end with a book review today in today's episode on 5 Types of Wealth by Sahil Bloom. And so let's get into today's episode. All right, most people aren't too busy; they are too distracted. That's what I'm starting with today in my intentionality corner. So I want to read this to you, some thoughts, and then kind of explain some extra insights. Here's reality: most people aren't too busy. They're simply too distracted. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with somebody where reading came up, and I remarked that I had changed some of my habits that year, and I had read more books in that year than ever before. This was a couple of years ago when I really started to read more, and it was like this happened sometime in the fall, and I think at that point I had read about like 54 books up until that point. And so I made a comment. I was like, "Yeah, I'm reading a lot, and here's how many books I read." I don't really know how it came up, but somehow it did. And then the immediate response by the person I was talking to was this. They said, "I wish I had enough free time to read that much." So that was their first response. Now, in reality, my friend's lack of reading that many books actually had nothing to do with free time or the lack of time or my apparent abundance of it. I guess I just have tons of free time and to do whatever I want. And it actually had nothing to do with that at all. What it really had to do with was distraction. You see, busyness is a choice, and which means all of us get to decide how we are going to spend our time. And the problem that most people run into is that we can often let life, instead of our priorities, decide for us. So we let life instead of our priorities decide how we are going to spend our time. And if we don't choose how to spend our time, it will always, not sometimes, not occasionally, but it will always appear as if we don't have enough of it. And so, in response to my friend who said, "I wish I had that much free time," my first thing I said to them was, well, let me check the screen time report on your phone and see how much free time you had this week. At which point he agreed that it probably wasn't about a lack of time. Now, I share that story not because everybody has to read a lot or needs to read a lot. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. In fact, there are other great ways that you can spend your time, that other people spend their time, that I don't. So there's lots of ways you can spend your time. It doesn't have to be reading. But I do share it to say that if there were something we wished we spent more time doing, or if we wish there was something different about our life, so for example, we wish we read more or exercised more or spent more time developing a skill or a talent or a gifting, that sort of thing. If we wish that were the case, the first thing we should do is examine where we allow distraction to suck away our time. So using my conversation about reading as an example, you could say this: if we want to spend less time on our phones, we should set a goal of how many minutes a day we are actually allowed to use it. If we want to read more books, we should set a goal of how many minutes a day we actually want to read. Or if we want to read more books, we should also determine when on our schedule we will set aside time to read. So it's not just when I feel like it or when I'm sitting around, but like on my calendar, hey, I'm going to spend some time reading today. Here's exactly when I'm going to do it. You see, the more we are proactive with our goals and desires, the less space we leave for distraction. So the more proactive we are about the things we want to do, the less we're going to be distracted and allow distraction to pull us away from the more important things that we wish we could do. You see, desire alone won't bring us to the destination we long for. It's not enough to wish. You actually have to prioritize it in your calendar. And so what happens is distractions occur when we have no plan of action. So it is easy to get sidetracked because it's like, well, I want to do that thing, or I wish I could do that thing, or it would be nice to do that thing, but we don't actually plan when to do it. And so lo and behold, our time kind of slips away and we never actually get to it. See, the reality is this: time isn't the problem. Time isn't the problem. It's allowing the distraction of things that aren't important to get in the way of what matters most. It is not time. It's not that we're too busy. It's that we're too distracted. Now, a couple of thoughts. A big reason for this distraction, the reason why we're distracted, is not because we inherently can't focus or can't do the thing. It's because we have not thought about the plans or the habits, or we don't have an idea of what we want to be doing instead. So we say, for example, it would be nice to read more, we haven't actually planned how much do I want to read per day, or do put on my calendar to actually make sure I read. And so we just never get to it. We get lazy. We sit on the couch. We turn on TV. We scroll on our phone. 30 minutes later, we actually feel worse. And lo and behold, we don't have any time. Now, what I want to say is this does not mean that you must always be doing things to develop a skill or learning. You actually can also be intentional about the things that you want to do that are relaxing and plan for them. So remember, I just want to point this out. Nobody feels better after scrolling on their phones. It's like, where did the time go? I probably am more envious or jealous of other people. I wish my life was different. I kind of feel lazy. No one wants to do that. However, if you like, I got a show you want to watch. For example, you could say, hey, I want to finish this TV series and then watch that without scrolling for 30 minutes. So you say, you know what, tonight, 7 o'clock-ish or whatever, I want to watch this TV show, 8 o'clock, I want to watch this TV show. And so when that time comes, instead of scrolling on your phone for 30 minutes, and then it's like, well, I don't even know if I have time for this show, or I'm still going to watch the show, but I'm going to stay up later because I was scrolling on my phone, you actually can do the thing you want to do. So I just want to say, you can plan the things you want to do as well, but you have to be intentional. Everybody could read more or exercise more or do the thing more, whatever the thing, practice their instrument. Everybody could. It's just they haven't been intentional about it, so you never actually get around doing it. In the moment, you might not feel like sitting down at the piano, but if you give yourself like 3 minutes, once you're in it, you'll actually be glad that you did. You see, here's the reality. Everyone has the same amount of time to do all the things. Most people are simply too distracted to do them. It's not about time. It is about distraction. So it's again, hey, I want to read a chapter a day. So before I do this, or before I scroll on my phone, or for whatever, I'm going to read a chapter. So you read a chapter, you have less time on your phone. Maybe you don't even feel like spending time on your phone, or maybe you do both. That's fine too. But you've actually planned, hey, I'm going to make sure I do this thing before I do this other thing. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not about always doing a lot of stuff, but you also can plan the things that you find enjoyment in. And I would just say, you will always feel better for doing the thing instead of scrolling on your phone. And I know if you've found a lot of this example is because this is where most people are spending their time, because we're so addicted and it's so habitual just to pull it out, to check that one thing, or just because you're bored, and then lo and behold, 5 minutes has gone here, 10 minutes has gone here, 27 minutes has gone there, and then you wonder why you can't read more books, for example, as my friend said. So again, everyone has the same amount of time. Most people are simply too distracted to do them. And so put it on your calendar, be proactive about the things you want to do instead of being reactive about things that happen in your life. And then magically, you'll have the time to do the things you want to do. Again, most people aren't too busy. They're too distracted. Now, the faith reflection for this episode, I want to talk a little bit about the snake in Genesis, and more so, why is it a bad thing to want to know the difference between good and evil? If you're familiar with the Genesis story, Adam and Eve, they can eat from any tree in the garden except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you might be like, why? Or you might even say, okay, I get God wants Adam and Eve to trust him, and he wants to give them some free will to demonstrate whether or not they trust him. But why is it like the tree of the good and evil that's bad? Like, why is it like, hey, don't eat this bad tree because it'll like make you feel bad? Like, you might wonder, isn't it not right? Isn't it not good to know the difference between good and evil? Like, don't you want your kids to know the difference between good and evil? So a couple of minutes, I want to expand on this. There's a lot more you could go a lot deeper, but just a couple of thoughts. I want to read Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, a couple of verses here, and just show you what's going on with this tree of the knowledge of good and evil that might be missed on just a surface level reading of the text. Chapter 3, verse 1, it says this: Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Now, a couple things about the snake. It's actually, the snake is talking, which you might be like, really? Like a snake talking? This is fictional. Who would believe this? I just want to say a couple things. You have to remember that we come to Scripture with way different assumptions and worldviews than the original audience that the various books were written to. So for us, when we read about a talking snake in a modern American context, or just a modern context in general, we think like it's creepy. It's an animal that we really don't like. It's an animal like we're scared of. Like, you might wonder if a snake talked to me, like I would run away from it. I wouldn't even get close to it. For ancient Israel and for many ancient cultures at the time, snakes actually had a much bigger and emotive meaning than they do for us. So they weren't like creepy, crawly, get away from them. They actually were different. For example, one historian, Nahum Sama, I apologize if I mispronounce that name, writes this: throughout the ancient world, the serpent was endowed with divine or semi-divine qualities. It was venerated as an emblem of health, fertility, immorality, occult wisdom, and chaotic evil, and it was often worshipped. The serpent played a significant role in the mythology, the religious symbolism, and the cults of the ancient Near East. So, for example, even in your history classes, you might have a little bit of remembrances of studying Egypt and all the stuff that they had going on with their snakes. And of course, you have to remember too, the Israelites are coming out of Egypt. So the Torah, the first five, the Old Testament, especially the first five books of the Bible, begin to be composed or put together soon after the Exodus from Egypt, where the snakes were a big deal. So we get the beginning of the writings of Moses starting to get compiled and written when Israel has just left Egypt. And so snakes are a big deal to ancient Egyptians or Israelites. Also, I want to point this out, that the Bible says the serpent was cunning, shrewd, or crafty. Different ways you could you could translate that word. It was cunning, it was shrewd, it was crafty. Different translations say different things, which to us comes across as negative, especially if you know how the story plays out. So if you're like, well, if the snake was cunning or the snake was shrewd, and you know that he's trying to tempt them, well, then you already associate negative ideas with those words. In fact, places like Proverbs where it talks about a room, how so in the Hebrew, it says that the snake was a room, which could be crude, cunning, or crafty, or shrewd. There's shrewd, crafting, or cunning, different ways you can do it. It's a Hebrew word, arum. However, in the book of Proverbs, a room is actually a worldly pursuit. So it talks about shrewdness or cunningness as a positive light. It's often seen as a remedy for being naive. But there are also, at the same time, places like in the book of Job or in the book of Exodus, where the word arum is seen as a negative thing. In other words, what this means, this idea of being a room or crafty or cunning or shrewd, arum, is good or bad depending on how you use it. It is a neutral thing that can be good or bad depending on how you use it. And so, picking up from Genesis chapter 2, which is right before Genesis chapter 3, the serpent asks if God really said you can't eat from any tree in the garden. So that's his question to Eve that we read about in verse 1. Of course, if you read Genesis 2, that's not what God actually said to Adam and Eve. He said you could eat from any tree, just not that one, just not one tree. That's what he actually said, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which again sounds weird, like what's wrong with knowing the difference between good and evil? And of course, what's happening here is that the serpent wants God to appear as harsh and restrictive. That's his goal. He said you can't eat from anything. How harsh, how restrictive, why would you want to honor him? By the way, again, this is the exact opposite of Genesis 2, where we're literally told the entire garden is for Adam and Eve except for one tree. So the serpent is trying to paint God as harsh and restrictive. In reality, he's very generous and kind and open and loving. So that's what he says, verse 1. Again, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat from the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat it or touch it, or you will die. So Eve somewhat corrects the serpent, although she does so incorrectly. I just want to point out, as the biblical scholars like to point out, it is worth noting that Eve adds something that God did not. God did not say that Adam and Eve could not touch the fruit from the knowledge of good and evil. He said they could not eat it. And so here, the narrative includes this added detail in her response that we can't even touch it. But it does nothing with it as the story continues. So it doesn't delve on that further. And you might say, well, if they shouldn't eat it, it might be wise for them not to touch it as well, which is true. But it's just worth pointing out that Eve actually doesn't even give the correct response. All God says is you shouldn't eat it. And then it's not exactly what he says, but maybe somewhat close. Verse 4. And so the serpent's response is, no, you will not certainly die. The serpent said to the woman, verse 5, in fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree in the middle of the garden, you'll actually be like God, and you'll know the difference between good and evil. So here, the serpent not only contradicts what God says, but he also presents the fruit of the tree as something worth obtaining for what you will get. And God is only holding it back from you. So not only should you eat it, as opposed to what God says, but if you do eat it, you'll actually get something that God doesn't want you to have. You actually find freedom and autonomy and all these things. In fact, you could paraphrase the meaning of what the serpent says in verses 4 and 5 as don't think death is such an immediate threat. So it says in verse 4 in our translation, many translations, no, you will not certainly die. It's this idea of don't think death is an immediate threat. It's not so much that he is saying, of course you're not going to die. It's not so much that he's saying that, but rather it's kind of like to say, don't focus on that, but focus on what you'll gain. Don't worry about the dying thing. Focus on all the stuff you'll get if you eat from it. And now I want to mention this. It is kind of confusing. This is where it gets confusing. What is wrong with knowing the difference between good and evil? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's kind of confusing. Now, why is this a bad thing? And aren't they supposed to rule? So if you read the first couple of chapters in Genesis, God creates humanity to rule and co-rule the earth with him. So he invites them to rule and manage his creation with him. And so if they're supposed to do that, it's like, well, shouldn't they know the difference between good and evil? And why should they be punished for doing something wrong? Also, if they don't know the difference between good and evil, so why would God punish them for doing something they shouldn't do if they don't really know the difference? Now, here's what's helpful: good and evil, again in Hebrew, come from the words tov and ra. Good and evil come from the Hebrew words tov and ra. Now, the word evil in English typically has a really narrow focus connected with moral evil. But ra, actually, which is how we translate evil, ra in Hebrew is actually more generic beyond just simple morality. So, for example, good in English is more broad, which again, tov and ra are broad terms in Hebrew. So good in English is actually a good translation of the Hebrew word tov, because it can be morally good. So we can say, hey, that's a good person, that's a morally good person. But good can also mean like pleasant or enjoyable. Like that was a good sandwich, let's say, or that was a good time. And it's not a morally or cosmically right or good thing. It's just something that you enjoyed. So there can be a moral component to the word good. There also could just be like an enjoyable component to the word good. So it's got a very broad meaning. But in English, the word bad can refer to both he is a bad person. So that's why good is a good thing. Many scholars point out that actually understanding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it's actually better to understand the word good and bad, because bad better encapsulates what raw actually means, because bad in English is more broad, just like the word raw is more broad and the word good is more broad. So for example, the word bad in English can refer to both a moral thing, like that's a bad person or that was a bad decision, but it also can more generally, like that was a bad sandwich, like I just didn't like it. And so it can be used, it's used all these ways in the Old Testament. So tov is used as a moral thing, it's used as a pleasurable thing, it's used as a preference thing in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, ra, which is translated as evil, is not just always used as a moral thing. Sometimes it's used as a preference thing, or like, hey, that's not a good thing, like I don't like it type of thing. Is a very broad use. So all that to say, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil certainly is not just talking about morality. So when we read good and evil, we just think, shouldn't they know the difference between like doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing? It's actually a lot more broad than that in the Hebrew. It's actually about decision making in all areas of life. So in all areas of life, not just like, hey, should I don't know, graphic example, stab someone or not, but hey, how should I respond in this situation? How should I invest my money? How should I plant these crops? So this good and bad is not just about morality. It's about general wisdom in general. And here's the problem. So here's the problem with Adam and Eve. The problem is that if one is not wise enough to make the right decisions, but they are given the ability and authority to make a bunch of decisions, well, a lot of poor decisions will be made. So if someone is given the authority or the ability to make decisions that they don't have the wisdom or the maturity to make, then a lot of poor decisions will be made. Let me give you an example. The phrase tov and ra, or knowing tov and ra in particular, like somebody knows tov and ra, is used 4 times in the Hebrew Bible. So we have 4 stories, which again, the Bible is a unified story of Jesus that we're supposed to read and reread. It is wisdom literature, and so when you read these stories, you begin to pick on more things. So there are 4 times in the Old Testament where knowing good and evil, knowing good and bad, better translation, knowing tov and ra are linked together in the Old Testament 4 times. One is in Genesis chapter 3, and if you track with me for a minute, this will show us how we're supposed to understand tov and ra in the Genesis story. One is in Genesis 3. Another one is in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, where it says, your children, your sons, who today don't yet know good and evil, will enter there. So talking about the Israelites about to enter into the land of the promised land. And apparently the sons of the Israelite leaders, or the sons of the sons and daughters, the kids that are part of the Israelites, don't yet know today good and evil. They don't know the difference between good and ra. It's talking about the promised land. So knowing tov and ra, good and evil, is a way of talking about a mature adult human who has discernment and knows the difference between good and bad. The other 2 cases as well, they all 4 of them, well, Genesis plus the other 3, the other 3 all involve children who are yet to mature unto a knowledge of tov and ra. So when you read all four stories in Genesis, or sorry, in the Old Testament, of someone knowing the Tov and Ra, it's always in the example or the story of people who do not yet have it. They're immature. They don't understand it yet. And so the question, therefore, is what does it mean for the first humans in the garden who have been given a great responsibility to rule and multiply? Again, that's why humans were created, to rule and to multiply. And yet they are depicted in a psychological sense as at least children who are yet to mature. So it's not that they were actually children in the garden, but they are depicted in terms of their knowledge as children. They don't know a lot of stuff yet. Adam and Eve are actually in the garden depicted here in their moral infancy. Like they're not mature, they don't know enough stuff. And so if you give them responsibilities, they might make some bad decisions. So if Adam and Eve and their descendants are to rule the world, they are going to have wisdom. So they're going to have to know the difference between good and bad if we're actually going to effectively rule the world. So this tree does not represent whether or not they are going to gain the knowledge of Tov and Ra. They will. They have to have it. But the question is, how are they going to go about acquiring it? How are they going to go about acquiring this knowledge and this maturity? Is it, I can take it because it is good in my eyes and I want it right now? Or the question is, will they allow God in his own time to give them the knowledge of Tov and Ra they need to be mature? And even though our situation is different, the question is the same thing for us. Will we go and take the thing that we want right now, even if we're not ready for it? Or will we trust the Lord that in his good timing, he will give us the knowledge that we need? Now, to be clear, what I'm saying here is not explicitly stated in the text, but it is heavily implied, especially, again, if you read and reread the scriptures, you read all the stories where it talks about someone knowing or not knowing Tov and Ra, the difference between good and bad, you begin to pick up this story that, oh, this is a story of someone trying to take something they're not yet ready for. In every case in the Old Testament, the knowing of Tov and Ra describes children who will one day mature, but they aren't ready yet. And so God tells Adam and Eve not to take it for themselves with the assumption that God will be the one who will make them wise, which again has to happen if they are going to rule the world. So they do need God's wisdom, but they have to do it and trust God and do it within God's timing and not their own. One Bible scholar, John Ralton, puts it this way: rather than God's putting the tree there simply to test Adam and Eve, which, by the way, this is how we typically think of it. We just think of it as a test. Actually, when you read the scriptures, it seems to be more than that. So again, here's this quote. Rather than God's putting the tree simply there to test Adam and Eve, it is more in keeping with his character to understand that they would have use for it in the future. When the time was right, the first couple would be able to eat from it. They would be. So what seems to be happening, again, when you read these stories, it's not that, hey, this is going to be here. You can never have it. I just want to see if you're going to trust me. I want to test me. It seems to be, when you read these stories, that in their due time, at the right time, when they are ready, God will grant them access to it. The question is, will they trust him? And that's the question for us. That's one of the questions we get when you read this when you read this text, this story, in Genesis 3. Who will we trust? Who will we trust? Because again, what at stake here, it is not about God withholding or trying to trick Adam and Eve. That's not what's going on. Rather, what it is an invitation for Adam and Eve to trust him. And I just want to point out, based on what everything God has done so far in the story, they have good reason to trust him. He has created them. He's given them this perfect place, garden to live in. He has provided all of their needs. There is no reason yet for them not to trust him. There's no reason for them not to trust him. It's kind of like this. We all know what it is like as a child not to understand our parents or really all that they have done for us, and that we should trust them. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, abusive parents, absent parents. I get that. But generally speaking, as a kid, you don't really understand all that your parents have done for you and the wisdom behind all their rules until you get older yourself and maybe have kids yourself, and then you start teaching them some similar things and your kids don't understand. It's like, man, they don't have the wisdom and knowledge. They don't really understand. They can't and you really also, they're not in a place where you can really explain every single rule to them. And so they're gonna have to trust you. And whether or not they trust you will determine whether or not they get in trouble and that sort of thing. And so again, after this, the story goes on, and I'm not going to keep reading the story here, but I just want to point this out. In the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a better understanding it, I would submit to you, is good and bad, because it's not just about moral categories, it's just about life wisdom. It was not simply there to test Adam and Eve. It was there to say, hey, this is going to be for you. When you are ready, will you trust me with that? Will you trust me with that? And that's a little bit of what's going on in Genesis chapter 3. Switching gears here to the cultural analysis, I want to share a article I read this week, which was really, it might not sound fascinating at first, but man, it was like really, really interesting. It was one of those things where like, I don't really care about this, but I'm going to read it anyway and be like, man, that was like really good. So this article is called Cars Beneath the Ground by Alfie Robinson. Cars Beneath the Ground by Alfie Robinson on May 15th, 2025 is when it was written. It's on aeon.co, aeon.co. But if you just Google Cars Beneath the Ground by Alfie Robinson, you'll be able to find it. Here's what the first couple sentences say of this article. It says the motor car is one of the defining features of modernity. Society was transformed by the internal combustion engine and its utopian promises for society. Cars made distant places accessible for the first time, creating fast, long-distance personal transport that was never before thought possible. Like all technologies, this came at a cost. The biggest problems were for our cities, which had to contend with noise pollution, air pollution, and the loss of streets and neighborhoods. The car shaped the form that cities, indeed societies, took in the 20th century. So, article goes on to talk about the problem with the rise of car use, especially in urban areas, is where you're going to put all of them, because they weren't designed for cars. And once more people started buying cars, I mean, it's okay if like there's a couple here and there, but if more people start buying cars and driving them around, especially in dense populations and places, like where are you going to put them? What are you going to do? Article goes on to say this. Many of us have spent a great deal of time searching for a free spot in city centers only to find nothing. It turns out that there's a name for this. It's called cruising. That might seem like a niche complaint, but research shows us, I found this fascinating, research shows us that as much as 15% of urban traffic can be caused by cruising alone. The result is a measurable increase in carbon emissions and localized pollution. So again, we've all been there driving downtown, driving somewhere, trying to find a place to park, and you just like driving around, circling. In some places, as much as 15% of that traffic is people simply trying to find a place to park. Fascinating. It goes on to say this, even if you do find a space, that space is at the expense of everyone else. I never thought about this. This is where I found what I found really fascinating about the article, one of the things. So that if you find a space, that space is expensive of anyone else. Surface space for doing anything other than parking can be worth a lot of money, but we seldom realize it because we have lived with street and surface parking for decades. In other words, as we all know, if someone was to build a storefront or to build something, especially in a downtown area, it's like the land costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money. And the article goes on to say this, and this parking is often rented out much more cheaply than the market price, subsidizing low-density neighborhoods, hence urban sprawl. So here's the problem. Because it is relatively cheap to park a car, a lot of people do it. And here's what I mean by cheap. Parking meters, you might not know this, I think because we all complain about parking, but parking meters should actually charge way more than they actually do if they were going to charge the going market rate for the land that they're on. Again, a lot of times these urban places, if you're going to build something or have a shop or whatever, you got to pay a lot of money per month. And if you divvy that out, how much we charge for parking spaces, they're really underpaid. They're underpaid. They are way more expensive than what we rent them out on when people rent them out, for hours at a time. Thus, what happens is you get more spread out cities because cars take up space cheaply, so people use them to enter into the city. So cars end up taking a lot of space, and because it's relatively cheap to park a car, more people are driving in, and you got all these cars, but you don't have any room for them. And so the urban sprawl, in part, is because of parking, because you got to spread out to accommodate all the people who are now driving in, which takes up a lot of room. In fact, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, underground railways and subways began to be built because buildings were in the way on the land. So some people looked into making underground parking lots. So again, as the railways began to be built, it's like you can't like build a railroad in the middle of a building. And so this is where like subways and some of the underground, especially a lot of the places in Europe and some of the heavily density cities in America as well, but especially in Europe when there's not a lot of like open space, open land, they started to build underground railroads. And so some people are like, well, why don't we do this for parking? Because that would save up a lot of space. Now here's kind of how what happened and why there's not a ton of underground parking today. So again, history here is fascinating. Cars really didn't become popular on a large scale until the 1950s, as that is when the average household incomes grew a lot, especially in America and in Western Europe following the war, which means more people could afford a car. So you got more cars around, you got more places to put them. And so soon, urban centers were packed with cars because more people could afford them. And in America, again, this is where it's different than Europe. America is much more undeveloped, has way more undeveloped land than Europe does, and so parking lots and freeways were a lot easier to implement here than they are over there. There was also less desire to reorganize cities and less money than the U.S. had. So Europe had less money following the war and all that than the United States had, and so public squares that used to be full of people started to be filling up with cars in America, but especially in Europe. And so, what do we do? Especially because again, in Europe, they couldn't really afford to build out all these places. They didn't have the land like we did. The article then goes to focus on the Maastricht project in the Netherlands, which in the 1960s, they began to build an underground parking lot below the center town square, where it is still free of cars today due to that lot. So under the city square in the city in Netherlands, they built an underground parking lot where today it's still in use. And so the town square is just people. There's no cars there. Now, that sounds really great. The problem, though, is that these things are very expensive to build. So underground parking, while looks great, they are very expensive to build. And then the article talks a little bit more about why the United Kingdom didn't try the underground route. So it became a little bit more popular in Europe, other than United Kingdom. And so talk about that. And then I just want to focus on the United States because that's where probably most of you are listening from. Here's why the United States did not build underground parking lots. The article says this: the U.S. love affair with the motor car is long and spirited. The country was far richer far earlier than Europe. The massive aircraft building capacity in the United States switched after the Second World War to the production of private cars. Dwight Eisenhower's post-war interstate highway system created an unprecedented high-speed road network, adding to the demand for cars. You might expect infrastructure to match the world-beating car ownership rates, including underground parking. This wasn't the case. Underground parking is rare in the United States. Why? Well, again, the article goes on to talk about a big reason is space. So places like New York City only have about 1% of their land for parking, which is very Europe-like. New York City. But a lot of other U.S. cities, that's not a problem. Many other, even big U.S. cities, have between 30 to 40% of their land spent on parking. So cost and necessity of underground parking was never taken on as much in the United States because it wasn't needed as much. You could just build out. Of course, and part of this too, the reason why we could build out, especially in cities, we did have some infrastructure, and so why didn't we build them, or what do we do with them? Many cities and towns, the article goes on to explain, demolish large portions of undesirable neighborhoods. So again, Black, Hispanic, Asian neighborhoods were often simply torn down and built through. So in some of these bigger city centers, the reason why we were able to implement highways and all these parking lots, that sort of thing, is unjustly, the American government, went through Black neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, and would build highways and would build roadways, and they wouldn't let them do anything about it. And so that's part of how that happened here in the United States. And so again, while the underground parking route that was pursued in some places in Europe might sound better, like, wow, I wish that would happen here. It also has issues. The article talks about how the cost for one is really expensive, especially when parking lots are underused, which means there's not enough reinvestment in the infrastructure for these underground parking lots if they're not used enough, which is the problem in a lot of these places in Europe that has them. And they actually sounds really great, but they're really expensive to build. They're expensive to maintain, and if they're not used, then the cost to maintain them doesn't happen, and it doesn't really happen. So the article ends by going to talk more about parking in Europe and different ideas on how to address it. But I just thought that was fascinating. Again, the rise of parking and how it's different between here and the United States, here in Europe, and how the war and all that stuff played into it. All right, my book review for today's episode. I want to share The 5 Types of Wealth, which is I think it was written last year, and I was looking forward to read the book because I saw a lot of good reviews, which is kind of like how I find my books. And then in Wake County, where I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, Wake County, our library has a lot of the main books, and so I can reserve it, and there's a wait list. And this one took 2 months for me to read, so my expectations were pretty high. Now maybe it's because our library didn't have that many copies of this one, or the libraries in all of our counties, but I saw good things about it, and then it took me forever to get to actually for my turn to actually pick up the book. And so I want to share some things I learned and some takeaways from the book. Again, the 5 Types of Wealth. So this book is not all about finances, which is what I originally assumed the book was about because I just read 5 Types of Wealth and didn't read the subtitle. It's not just about finances. The goal of this book is to help you help you build and live a well-rounded life. And the 5 areas of wealth it looks at are time, social, mental, physical, and financial. So financial is one of them, but here's the 5 areas that you can build like a life of wealth in your time, in your social, relationships, um, in your mental health, your physical health, and your financial health. That's ways you can be wealthy. Overall, it is a decent book. A good amount of the concepts weren't new to me, given how much I read in this have already read in these areas. But that's not the book's fault. So I will say some of my book reviews. It should be a caveat. Like I read these a lot, and so because I read it a lot, and some of this stuff isn't really necessarily new. Whereas if I didn't read as much, I might enjoy the book more. So that's not really the book's fault that I've read a lot on the subject, but anyway, it was my experience. In my opinion, the book does suffer, however, from trying to be too helpful. The second part of the book really breaks down the 5 types of wealth in more detail, and then it gives you a lot of things to think through and consider. And I get the idea behind it because it's like, hey, if you want to implement your stuff, hey, let me give you all these ideas and you could take and leave what you want to do, which is essentially what the book says. But when a book is giving you that much information, it can be overwhelming to do anything it says. Because when someone says, hey, take it or leave it, it's like, well, I don't know which ones are wise and which ones are not wise, so I'm going to read all of it. And so I do think the book is better than my personal enjoyment rating, which is my scale of 1 to 10, just how much I enjoyed the book. But because many of the book's concepts weren't that new to me, and it gives too many things to think about, in my opinion at least, it knocked it down a little bit. So I gave it a 6.5 out of 10. Again, 8 through 10, I recommend for pretty much everybody. 6 and 7, I like some things, but other things were a drawback. And 5 and below, I wouldn't recommend it at all. I would say this, one of the things I've noticed in some books is, man, just you can give me multiple things to think through, but you got to be very clear on just a couple of key themes. If you try to be too helpful, it is overwhelming and it's like, I don't know what to pick. And so he gave a lot of options and exercises, and there's also 5 different, areas that he focuses on, which is just a lot. And so again, he says you can kind of pick and choose, but as a reader, I mean, you're going to read all of it, and it just kind of feels like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, what am I supposed to say? So that's kind of knocked down for me. Now, here a couple things, other takeaways from the book. The author is not a Christian. And here's why I say this. I actually appreciate that he didn't try to tie in Christian teachings. There are a few times where he mentioned religions and, principles from other religions or philosophies and spirituality when he talks about that a little bit. I appreciate that he doesn't try to pull in a Bible verse or pull in a verse from Jesus, because a lot of non-Christians, and even some Christians too, but a lot of non-Christian authors who try to pull in a verse from Jesus or a saying from Jesus, they can often explain it incorrectly because they don't get the context, or they haven't read all 4 Gospels, and so they've only cherry picked a few things, and so they have a very caricaturized view of Jesus, not a Jesus that's actually represented in the Gospels. So I appreciated that the few times he did mention other religions and ideologies, he didn't mention Christianity. I just appreciate that because they didn't get it wrong. However, he did make one claim about Christianity. And again, as a pastor, this stuff sticks out to me. He did say that Christianity was the reason that people had a poor view of their body from about the year 500 to the year 1500 AD. So it's kind of a broad strokes paragraph for about 1,000 years. He talks about the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, which historians will tell you that's actually not accurate ways to describe those time periods. But anyway, and the negative view of the body, and then the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and blah, blah, and it came back. And he just kind of blamed it on Christianity. And of course, my thing is you can make a statement, but you got to have some data, especially when you try to say something so shocking like that. And it was just he just said it, and it was a self-evident thing in a paragraph, and didn't give any really strong reason behind it. And so obviously I reject that, but I was like, man, you should have left that out. He kind of blamed 1,000 years of body negativity on Christians. It was weird. Meaning in life is hard to find subjectively. So just a reminder. And I just want to say it is hard to have without a Christian worldview. And so trying to find meaning in life, especially in a book like this, where it's so much of it is up to you and what you like and what you think is best. It's just hard. If there's not some sort of standard objective outside of yourself that is pulling you, that can guide you, that can teach you, that can give you meaning, and you're supposed to find it by yourself, that's just really hard. So that was a weakness. Again, he's not a Christian, so I can't knock him for it, but that's the weakness of the book. It's when meaning is so subjective, you don't know if you found it. And so I think the book suffers. I will say this: the book is helpful if you are willing to do the work. There are a lot of concepts, but if you're in a season of life where you're experiencing life change, or maybe a career change, or you're just trying to make some change in your life, I do think overall the book would be helpful. And one thing they did take away from the book, just a reminder that a little intentionality will radically change your life. You just got to be like intentional in a few key areas. And again, as we shared about in my opening thing about busyness and distraction, most people are simply too reactive instead of proactive with their life and their time. And it is much easier because that is much easier than being proactive. But also, I would say that people think being proactive is actually harder than it is. Like just a few small disciplines. Hey, I'm going to do this every day or 3 times a week or whatever. Just having a few small disciplines over the long haul can radically change your life. And I think that's what a good thing about this book that it points out is that, man, just a few small areas. And you don't have to do all the things, but a few small areas that you're intentional with can radically change your life, which again, is part of why I'm doing this show, trying to help you be more intentional. And so that is the book review for this episode. As always, thanks again for joining me on The Intentional Life. If you're on the socials, especially Instagram, Twitter, that's where I spend the most time, or X, I should say now, Dylan J. Dodson, I would love to connect with you there. Again, if you're new to the show, share it with a friend. Let them know if you find it helpful, and I'll be back with you next week for another episode of The Intentional Life.